In the world of homicide, a black widow is the term given to a woman who chooses a mate, marries, and kills him for profit.
Her appeal to the Fifth Circuit was turned down. She showed no emotion.
Betty Beets was convicted in 1985 for the murder of her fifth husband, Jimmy Don Beets. His body and that of her fourth husband were found buried in her yard.
At 6:18 p.m. on February 24, 2000, in the execution chamber of the Huntsville unit in Texas, the state prepared to end a life. The air was thick with the sterile silence that precedes a final act. Strapped to a gurney, a 62-year-old great-grandmother lay waiting. She was inmate number 810. To the world, she was Betty Lou Beets. She had 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. From a distance, she could have been any matriarch, a face you'd recognize from a church picnic or a quiet neighborhood street. But Betty wasn't there for being a loving grandmother. She was there to become only the second woman executed in Texas since the reinstatement of capital punishment. The state was killing her for murder, cold-blooded, calculated murder. When the warden leaned in and asked the required question, if she had any last words, Betty remained silent. There were no apologies for the families of the men she'd killed, no final explanations, no pleas for forgiveness. Instead, she offered a small, enigmatic smile to her lawyer and pastor, then closed her eyes. 2 coughs, 1 sharp gasp, then nothing. But the silence that followed her death did not bring closure. It only amplified the chilling questions left behind, because Betty didn't kill once. Over 2 decades, husband after husband either vanished or was shot. The woman who looked like everyone's sweet grandmother had turned her own backyard into a private graveyard. And the final, haunting question remains. Was the woman on that gurney a monster, or was she the product of a monster? Our story begins not in a death chamber, but in this quiet corner of East Texas, a place of weekend fishing trips and tranquil lakeside living. It was here in 1983 that Dallas fire captain Jimmy Don Beets disappeared without a trace. His abandoned boat was found adrift, his heart medication scattered across the deck. For 2 years, the official story was a tragic accident, a drowning. The case was closed, but the truth was not lost in the water. It was buried just 50 feet from his own front door, hidden in plain sight, beneath a decorative brick wishing well. This case is more than a simple murder for hire. It's a 2-decade-long saga of manipulation, violence, and a series of husbands who met brutal ends. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. How does a hearing-impaired woman from rural North Carolina become one of the most notorious black widows in American history? And was justice truly served on that February evening? Or did the state of Texas execute a woman whose story was far more complicated than the headlines suggested? This is the executioner's pen. Our mission is to examine the fine line between justice and vengeance, and to understand the paths that lead to the final sentence. If you believe in the importance of these complex stories, consider subscribing to support our work. To understand the woman on the gurney, we must travel back to Roxborough, North Carolina, March 12, 1937. Betty Lou Beets was born into a world of hardship. This was the post-Depression era South, a landscape of tenant farms and textile mills where poverty was a generational inheritance. Her childhood was not one of innocence, but of survival. A severe bout of measles, a common childhood illness before widespread vaccination, left her with a permanent hearing impairment. In a world that already offered few opportunities, this further isolated her, creating a barrier of silence between her and the outside world. But according to Betty, the silence was preferable to the sounds within her own home. Decades later, from death row, she would make a harrowing claim that her father had sexually
All
abused
my
her.
mama's life, she's been abused. I've seen her beaten up by her husband so many times I can't remember.
My dad never beat her. There is no police reports, no hospital reports of any abuse.
It was a charge never reported, an accusation that would only surface when her life was on the line, leaving it to hang in the air, impossible to verify. and easy for prosecutors to dismiss as a desperate fabrication. When Betty was just 12, her mother was institutionalized, leaving a child to raise her younger siblings. The trauma of this maternal abandonment, compounded by her other struggles, effectively ended her childhood. At 15, desperate for an escape route, she married her first husband, Robert Franklin Branson. Over the next 17 years, she would have 6 children. The marriage was a chaotic cycle of breakups and reconciliations, finally ending in divorce in 1969. This divorce marked a turning point. It was the beginning of a pattern that would grow increasingly dark. Betty would marry 5 more times. These were not stories of love, but of escalating violence. Her second husband, Bill Lane, whom she married twice, was shot by Betty. He survived and later testified he had threatened her first, leading to her acquittal. In 1978, she tried to run over her third husband, Ronnie Threlcold, with her car. He also survived. Both men would later take the stand and testify against her. A clear pattern was emerging. Betty married men, the relationship soured, and violence erupted. To law enforcement, it looked like a history of domestic disturbances. In retrospect, it looks like rehearsal. For a time, her husbands kept surviving, until they didn't. On the evening of August 6, 1983, the small house by the lake was quiet. Inside sat 3 people: Betty Lou Beets, her son from her first marriage, Robert Branson, and her 5th husband, 46-year-old Jimmy Don Beets, dozing in his favorite recliner after a long week with the Dallas Fire Department. The scene was deceptively peaceful. It was the perfect stage for what Betty had planned. At some point that evening, Betty pulled her son aside. Her words, as Robert would later recount them in a courtroom, were delivered with a chilling calm. "I'm done with Jimmy," she said. Robert assumed she meant divorce. He was wrong. "Jimmy has to die tonight," she stated, not with anger or tears, but with the simple finality of someone discussing a household chore. Then she gave him an order. "Leave. No explanation. Just go." Robert Branson walked out the door and drove away. He didn't call the police. He didn't question his mother. In a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, he just left his stepfather alone with her. Inside, Jimmy Don had no idea his life was being measured in minutes. According to the prosecution's narrative, built on Robert's testimony, Betty walked into the living room holding a .38 caliber pistol. Jimmy never saw it coming. She raised the gun, fired twice. Both bullets struck him in the head. He died instantly, slumping forward in the chair that had just become his deathbed. 2 hours later, Robert returned. His mother was waiting in the kitchen. Jimmy's body remained in the recliner. "Help me get rid of the body," Betty said, and he did. What they did next would transform a piece of garden decor into a tomb, and it would set in motion a cover-up so brazen it would fool everyone for years. But what investigators would eventually uncover in that yard would change this case from a single murder into the hunt for a serial predator. The morning after the murder, the cover-up began. Betty and her son Robert drove to the marina. There, they meticulously staged an accident. Betty crushed Jimmy's heart medication, scattering the powder across the boat's deck. Robert removed the propeller. They pushed the vessel into Cedar Creek Lake and let it drift. Later that day, a frantic Betty Lou Beets called the police. Her husband was missing. For 3 weeks, a massive search ensued. Rescue crews dragged the lake. Divers combed the murky depths. Firefighters from Dallas came to search for their lost captain. Throughout the ordeal, Betty played the part of the grieving widow to perfection. When the fire department chaplain came to offer comfort, her first questions were not about the search, but about money. Jimmy's life insurance, his pension benefits. The chaplain found it odd, but Betty explained it away as simple pragmatism. No one suspected that Jimmy's body lay just yards away, buried under the Texas sun. For nearly 2 years, Betty thought she had committed the perfect crime. But in the spring of 1985, an anonymous tip to the Henderson County Sheriff's Office shattered her story. The caller knew details only someone intimately involved could know. They said Jimmy hadn't drowned. He'd been murdered by his wife. Armed with a search warrant, investigators descended on Betty's property. From a police car, she watched, her expression reportedly calm and unreadable. They started with the wishing well in the front yard, a structure Jimmy and Robert had built together. After breaking through a layer of concrete, they found it. The carefully wrapped remains of a human body.
His body
shot
and that of
twice.
her fourth husband were found buried in her yard.
It was Jimmy Don Beets. But they weren't done. The informant had suggested there was more. The search moved to the back of the house, to a storage shed and patio. As they dug into the hard-packed earth, they made a second gruesome discovery. More human remains, badly decomposed. Dental records would identify the body as Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty's fourth husband, who had vanished without a trace in 1981. He too had been shot with the same caliber weapon. The backyard wasn't just a yard, it was a graveyard. The question was no longer if Betty Beets was a killer, but for how long had she been getting away with it? On July 11th, 1985, a 48-year-old Betty Lou Beets walked into the 173rd District Court of Henderson County to face capital murder charges. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense team's strategy was as desperate as it was shocking. They attempted to blame her own children for the murders, but the prosecution had a powerful, undeniable case. They had two bodies. They had the murder weapon, a .38 caliber pistol owned by Betty. And they had a clear motive. As established in the court record of Beets versus Collins, the state argued she killed for remuneration. Under Texas law, this is a critical distinction that elevates murder to capital murder, making a defendant eligible for the death penalty. It means killing for payment or the promise of payment. The prosecution argued that Jimmy Don Beets' life insurance policies and pension benefits, totaling over $110,000, constituted that payment. However, the prosecution's most devastating weapon was Betty's own son. Robert Branson took the stand and systematically dismantled his mother's defense. He told the jury everything. How she announced her plan to kill Jimmy, how he helped bury the body. He described his mother as a very selfish woman who cared only about money. His testimony was the linchpin of the state's case. Yet, lurking beneath the surface of the trial was a profound question of legal ethics that would cast a long shadow over the verdict. According to the 1993 appeal filed in the Fifth Circuit, Betty's own defense attorney, E. Ray Andrews, had secured the book and media rights to her life story for his son. This created a staggering conflict of interest. A lawyer's primary duty is to their client, but with a lucrative media deal on the table, a conviction and a death sentence could arguably make for a more compelling and profitable story. Had Andrews presented a robust defense centered on a lifetime of abuse, it might have saved Betty from the death penalty, but it may have also made for a less sensational narrative. The jury never heard extensive evidence of her past trauma, evidence that could have influenced their decision. Was Betty Lou Beets receiving a fair trial as guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment, or was she a pawn in a story her own lawyer stood to profit from? On October 11, 1985, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty of capital murder for remuneration. 3 days later, they handed down the sentence. Death. Betty Lou Beets showed little emotion as her fate was sealed. She became Texas death row inmate number 8 to 10. The sentence ignited a media frenzy and drew a sharp line in public opinion. To the family of Jimmy Don Beets, it was justice. To prosecutors, it was the rightful end for a cold, greedy killer who had manipulated and murdered for financial gain. But to others, the sentence was a chilling indictment of a system they felt had failed to look deeper. They saw a woman shaped by a lifetime of violence, now condemned to die by the state. The courtroom battle was over, but the fight for Betty Lou Beets' life and for the truth of her story was just beginning. For 15 years, Betty Lou Beets lived in the shadow of her execution date. Her case became a labyrinth of appeals, a slow crawl through the justice system. In a shocking turn, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals actually overturned her conviction in 1988, ruling that insurance benefits didn't legally count as remuneration. For a moment, she thought she was free, But the state requested a rehearing and the court reversed itself. The conviction stood. As legal doors slammed shut, her defense strategy shifted dramatically. The narrative of the greedy killer was replaced by a new one, the battered woman. Her daughters came forward, pleading for their mother's life. They appeared before the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, clutching photographs showing a bruised and battered Betty, images they claimed were proof of decades of abuse at the hands of her husbands. This became the central conflict of her final years. Was Betty Lou Beets a lifelong victim who finally snapped, a woman failed by a system that ignored her cries for help? Or was this a last-ditch cynical ploy for sympathy, a story concocted only after she was convicted of murder? The board was not convinced. The execution would proceed. In her final interviews, Betty maintained her innocence, a claim that seemed irreconcilable with the two bodies unearthed from her yard.
Yes,
Knowing that, feeling you have done nothing wrong.
yes,
Does that help you at this time?
yes, it helps me.
The battle over her past raises a crucial question about how our justice system evaluates claims of abuse, especially when they surface late in the legal process. If you believe these complex issues deserve more public awareness, let us know in the comments and support our channel by liking this video. February 24th, 2000. Her final day. Betty was transferred to the Huntsville unit. She declined her right to a last meal, requesting nothing. She spent her final hours meeting with her children, her lawyers, and a pastor. According to official reports, she remained calm, even cooperative. When told that her final appeal to the Fifth Circuit had been denied, she showed no emotion. In the witness room, waiting for the execution to begin, sat Jimmy Beets, the son of the man she had murdered and buried in a wishing well. He was there to see justice done for his father. He watched as the woman who had destroyed his family was strapped to the gurney. He would later tell reporters that Betty showed no expression at all, no fear, no remorse. She just lay there calmly, as if it were any other day. As the lethal cocktail of drugs began to flow into her veins, Betty Lou Beets did not address her victim's family. She did not confess. She did not ask for mercy. She simply turned her head, offered that small, inexplicable smile to her attorney, and closed her eyes. The final chapter of her violent life concluded not with a roar of defiance, but with a quiet, unsettling whisper. In the immediate aftermath of her execution, Betty's body was cremated, her ashes scattered over her mother's grave, the mother she lost to an institution when she was just a child. She left behind a sprawling family and a legacy of unanswered questions. The execution did little to settle the debate surrounding her case. To Jimmy Beets and the families of her victims, her death was a necessary conclusion. Justice, delayed for 15 years, had finally been served. But to anti-death penalty advocates and domestic abuse awareness groups, the execution of a 62-year-old great-grandmother was a barbaric act. They argued the state had killed a victim, ignoring a lifetime of trauma that forged her into a killer. Her case became a flashpoint, highlighting the extreme rarity of female executions and the complex optics of putting a grandmother to death. The two narratives of Betty Lou Beets remain in stark opposition. Was she the Black Widow of Gun Barrel City, a sociopathic predator who married, murdered, and collected for profit? Or was she a broken woman, a product of abuse who responded to violence with violence? The evidence presented at trial pointed overwhelmingly to the former, but the story she told from death row, supported by her daughters, painted a picture so tragic it gave even staunch death penalty supporters a moment of pause. What we know for certain is this: 2 men are dead, families were destroyed, and a woman who could have been anyone's grandmother became one of America's most notorious killers. The case of Betty Lou Beets is not just a story about murder, it's a story about narratives. The narrative the prosecution told the jury, the narrative her lawyers may have been compromised in presenting, and the narrative she herself constructed in her final years. The legal system delivered its judgment based on the evidence of her crimes, but the final moral judgment is more complex. Her case forces us to confront the cyclical nature of violence, how it can be passed down through generations, twisting its victims into perpetrators. It does not excuse her actions, but it complicates our understanding of them. Did her traumatic childhood create a monster, or was she simply born evil? Perhaps the most chilling truth is that both can be true at the same time. If this case has impacted you, please like this video and share it to help keep the memories of Jimmy Don Beets and Doyle Wayne Barker alive. Subscribe to The Executioner's Pen and join the conversation in the comments below. What does justice mean to you in a case like this? Thank you for watching.